Pardon? I am getting ready to start a live. Here we go. Nope, that's actually best practice. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching today. Thank you for joining me today as we talk about CSS preprocessors. So today, as we're talking about CSS preprocessors, we are looking specifically at SAS or SASS. I got a few slides here for us to just kind of go through really quickly. I don't want us to spend a ton of time on CSS preprocessors. I just want us to know what they are and just see one in action. So really more of the hands-on stuff that you get out of the module videos for this module. And really with modern CSS, so if we're building something from scratch nowadays, there has been stuff that's been created that basically mirrors just about everything that is done with SAS or SCSS now. So I think we will probably see SAS start to go away over the coming years, right? A big benefit of it was that it had features that, you couldn't just get from regular CSS. It's not quite at the point yet where it's going to go away completely. There are still a lot of people that are using CSS preprocessors. But I do think that maybe over the next 5 to 10 years, we will see CSS preprocessors sort of disappear because, a lot of the things that they're doing that regular CSS wasn't doing, well, now it's simply just being done in regular CSS. And if it's being done in regular CSS, we can offload that processing power from our servers to the browser, right? And so we'll first off just start off by answering the question of what is a CSS preprocessor, or what are CSS preprocessors? And so a CSS preprocessor is just a program that lets you generate CSS from the preprocessor's own unique syntax. So when we're thinking about a CSS preprocessor, we're thinking about a coding language where we are writing a specific code and then a process is happening that is taking that code and converting it to CSS or to regular CSS and sending it to the browser, to the user. And so when we think about a CSS preprocessor, to some degree, we can think about it like PHP, right? When we've worked with PHP in the past, we have, put things into PHP the server runs a process on that PHP, converts it into HTML, and then sends that to the browser, to your user. And so CSS preprocessors, in terms of how they work, aren't much different from that, right? You're basically writing your own little programming language. It's getting run through a process on the server, through an interpreter that's on the server. And in turn, that gets converted into regular CSS and sent to the user, which is why we have to do something a little bit different in this module to work with CSS, to work with this stuff than we normally would, because we don't have the CSS compilers built onto web servers that we can use. Right, so we'll use CodePen, which we'll see in just a minute here. But that is a key point to make, is that to use a CSS preprocessor, you have to install a CSS compiler onto your web server, and there are several of those. The one we're going to be using is called SAS, or SCSS. But that's one of many that are out there, right? So we'll have a look at that. But what this does is it changes CSS from a front-end language to a back-end language. And, you know, what it used to do is it gave CSS more functionality and made them more dynamic. We don't really see that as much anymore with this new stuff that we, see being added into CSS now, right? Like there's stuff that's been added into CSS within like this calendar year that are things that CSS preprocessors did previously. And so as these things are being updated and changed, right, I think we'll see CSS preprocessors sort of being outmoded in favor of just plain old CSS. In much a similar way that we see a lot of the old school frameworks, things like jQuery that we talked about earlier in the semester, kind of become outmoded just for regular old JavaScript. But, the big thing, again, is that preprocessors are back-end, right? We get a CSS, or an SCSS file that gets run through a process, converted to CSS, so you have to have the compiler installed, which is why we have to use CodePen. And these advantages of preprocessors are older advantages, right? Like we talk about better organization, we see that organization being changed now, right? Like we have the ability, or will have the ability soon, to do nested CSS rules, for example, in just regular old CSS, whereas that was something that started in the SCSS framework. We'll see variables, and the way we handle variables are a little different. We'll see, a lot of people find the syntax a little bit better, right? One of the things that we talk about when we talk about why people hate CSS so much is the idea that, well, CSS is challenging because it's not very much like code. Well, if we're able to take CSS and basically put it into a back-end programming language, then it becomes like code. So we see that happening there. People find it to be less time consuming. People find it to be more performant, easier maintenance, fewer HTTP requests because it's all done on the back end. And it gives us some things with color scheming and semantic tools, things of that nature, which we'll see in our demonstration here in a few minutes, that really make it well-liked, or was well-liked among programmers. So there are many different types of CSS preprocessors out there. The most popular ones are LESS, SAS, or SCSS, which is the one we're going to use. Stylus, PostCSS, AutoPrefixer. There are a lot of different ones out there. If we were to look at the most popular ones, those are LESS and SAS. So LESS is based in JavaScript. It looks more like JavaScript on the back end. SAS, the one we're going to be using, is based in Ruby, and it looks more like pure CSS. It does better nesting. It does, and it's sort of PHP like we mentioned, right? Like it's sort of a different layer that gets run through a process, converted into CSS, and sent to the browser. So it looks very similar to regular CSS, but the changes are there, right? And so we can see that both of these sort of have this overlap here in the middle: nesting, logic, mix-ins, and inheritance. Error notifications, right? Which is really still the biggest part about using CSS preprocessors is the idea that it is a programming language. So if it is a programming language and it has errors in it and it will not compile, it will let you know, right? Whereas with CSS traditionally, right, I'm sure we've all had these issues before where we made mistakes in our CSS and we had no idea that mistakes were made. And so we just had to comb through all of our code to try to figure things out. And so having the error notifications is probably still the biggest benefit to using something like a CSS preprocessor. So I mentioned we chose Sass to work with. Sass is the oldest CSS preprocessor. Has some more features. It's been worked on more. Less is a little more popular than Sass overall, primarily because it's JavaScript based and people like JavaScript. But really, usage is comparable. And if we looked at them side by side, there's not a whole lot of difference. But Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. SCSS is a modernized version of Sass. So if we look and we can break SCSS down, it stands for Sassy Cascading Style Sheets. So I'd like to take a little bit of time here and just do a quick demo just to show you some of the rules. I think the videos in the module do a little bit better of a job breaking down the different syntactic components of the CSS preprocessor. So you'll want to visit those and check those out as you're working on your lab assignments and things of that nature. But we're working in CodePen here for this because we need to have that backend. And so in order to do this, you would need a CodePen account. It is a free account. Some of you might already have one. If you don't, it's a good one to have. It's an easy thing. It's sort of like Replit. A lot of web developers and web designers like to have an account just to play around with stuff and do fancy things with it because it has some features that we don't see. I don't think Replit has something with a CSS preprocessor in it, but I guess it might be worth it to look. Because they've been doing a lot of updating and a lot of changing. So let me just, in another browser window here, let me see if they have anything with SCSS in it. It doesn't look like it. Looks like there might be some stuff in the community builds, but we don't necessarily trust that. So we'll just stick to CodePen here. It's codepen.io. It's a free account. And I'm going to go here to create a new pen. So I'm going to click that to create a new pen. I'm going to click this little pencil here, and this will be my SCSS demo. So we can just give it a quick name. And one thing that I'm going to need to do is just see these little gears here. There's one on the HTML. There's one on the CSS, and there's one on the JavaScript. And you can see when I click those, it gives me an option to pick a preprocessor. So if I click the one for CSS here, it gives me the option to do a CSS preprocessor. And from here, I can just pick SCSS. It also has old school Sass, it has less, it has stylus, and it has post CSS. So if you want to play around with one of these, test it out on your own, right? Because that's one of the best ways that we can learn something in programming is to just go in there and test it out ourselves. You know, you have the options to be able to go in here and do that. So I'm going to select SCSS, and I'm going to click Save and Close. And then once we have that, you'll see it says SCSS here on the CSS tab. You know, if we look here really quickly, since we haven't really used CodePen before, we can see that it has HTML preprocessors as well. And so these are primarily Markdown language, different types of Markdown languages, right? Like we see Markdown, we see Haml, different things like that. If we look in the JS, we see they have Babel, they have TypeScript, they have CoffeeScript, they have LiveScript. They have CDNs here to where you could put in things like jQuery if you wanted to. And just add it straight to the project from this page. It's pretty neat. And so to save us just a little bit of time here, I've already done a little bit of HTML. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of HTML that I've already wrote and put it in my HTML panel here. We'll see that, you know, this is just basic HTML, right? The kind of stuff we do all semester long. And we can click, we actually don't have to click anything to run it. One of the things that we see here is I used a class of column 6 here on the main. We know from the past that column 6 is a bootstrap thing. Col 6 is a bootstrap thing. We can actually add some bootstrap in here if we want to, right? Bootstrap and CSS doesn't, SCSS doesn't really clash with one another, right? They're two separate files. So we could go in here into this CSS gear. Go down here to the add external style sheets and type in bootstrap. And then we can just click bootstrap there. It'll add bootstrap to the CDN here. Click save and close. And then it's added bootstrap to our project. Right, which is pretty cool. And so we're going to focus on this CSS here. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to do variables using SCSS. So if you've used CSS variables before, and we've discussed them and played with them in classes before, you know that typically if I'm going to create a variable in CSS, I need to focus my root pseudo selector and then have a, you know, dash dash some sort of variable name, and then give it some sort of color value or whatever we want to do with it for a variable. And then when we get to some element, we can say background dash color var red, or var main color, var dash dash main color, something like that, right? And so in regular CSS, that's what we would do. But with a CSS preprocessor like SCSS, we don't have to do this sort of complicated thing. Here, where we're, you know, going into the root pseudo selector, we can just say something like $, right? We start off our variable names with a $, and when we started off with a $, then we can, you know, that's just like PHP, where a $, indicated that we that it is a variable, right? And so we can call this main color. And so the great part about that right, is that this variable, I can use that anywhere. I can use that anywhere. And notice that I did not put any curly braces here as well, right? Just declaring this variable is all we need to do here. So something that I might even want to do here is I might even want to just do something like $color val, right? And let that be a number. Because you'll note that we kind of have done, like we've done HSL in the past in other classes. So I can add color val here, make it some sort of number, like let's say 180. And so now in main color here, I can add an HSL. I can have the hue value be $color val, and just use that right in line there with a saturation of, say, 80% and a lightness of, let's say, 20%. Right, and so now that I have this main color here set, I can apply it to something, and it's going to work. For example, like if I wanted to apply it to the header, right? And I think that's the way I did it here, was I applied it to this color to the header. And so we can even do it to, say, the header and the footer at one time. Just the same way that we would work it with regular CSS. Background color here is going to be main color now. Right, we can see it updates those in kind. Right, so now all I have to do is just change this color value here to be whatever I want it to be. And it automatically updates it, which is pretty cool in and of itself, right? Like, but essentially what I've done here is I've laid the foundation to where I can use built-in functions in SCSS and template out this entire site, right? So let's add some of the stuff that we would normally add to, just to show that it's really not that different from CSS. Like if I wanted to add an asterisk selector here and say something like box sizing, border box, something like margin 0, padding 0, something like that, right? Like that's going to do it for us. And so since we added Bootstrap to this site, like those things were already done for us through Bootstrap. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out actually. But it doesn't throw any errors there. We can see that happens. So let's say I want a lighter version of this main color to be the background color of the site. How would we do that? It's actually pretty easy. So there is a built-in function in SCSS that allows us to take one existing color and come up with a lighter shade of it, right? And so this would be, say, $lighter color. And so there is a lighten function that is inside of SCSS where we could just take that main color value and lighten it up. Let's say we wanted to lighten it up by, say, 70. Now you'll see I just typed in main instead of main color, and it gave me a little red exclamation point down there at the bottom. It told me of my errors. Right, that's that thing I was talking about. Normally, if we're dealing with regular CSS, it doesn't do that, right? Because it doesn't compile like that. But thankfully, this does that. So if we make an error, we could see something like that, and we can fix it. But we would just add that as the background color to, say, the body. And we have an automatic, lighter color version of the site right in there. And so if we just change this color value, then it's going to update everything. And just for the sake of argument here, I'm going to color white here. Actually, you know what? I don't want to do that. I want to do something a little bit interesting. I'm going to nest some functions for the text color. So what if I want this text color in the header and the footer to be the opposite color of this main color? Well, we have a built-in function for that. So we'll have a $ text color. And this is just going to be for the header and the footer. So maybe we'll put like header color or heading color. And we'll set that equal to the adjust color, or adjust hue rather, function that already exists in SCSS. And we will just take the current brand color, which is going to be our main color, and shift it 180 degrees. So now if we add a color $ heading color here, we should see that color change, right? And so now instead of the purple, or instead of black here, we can see that it's a sort of dark green, right? Because it still has that same lightness value. However, we have this other function here, and we can just nest functions. So I can just wrap the lighten function around the results of that function and give it some sort of value to lighten it by. And that might have been too much there because that's basically taking it to white. Let's make it like 60. Let's try that, see what that does. Yeah, there we go. So now the header and the footer, they're right. And we haven't written that much CSS, right? And we haven't had to do any math. We're letting the code do math for us, which is pretty great. And it's just doing all this stuff for us. And if I want this website to be a different color, I just go up here and I just change that color value, and it adjusts everything accordingly. Right, which is pretty cool. So another thing that we can do here is we can actually write our own functions, right? These lighten functions are built into SCSS, but we can write our own functions. So if I wanted to write something that, say, took a value, and then based on the value parameter that we give it, it sets the height of an element to be a certain height. Well, we could do that. So let's write a function here that does that. In SCSS, we start that out with an @ symbol and the word function, and then we give it a name, set height. And then we'll give that an attribute value there, $M, so that when we call this function, we can call it with a value in those parentheses, the way we did here, right, with these predefined functions. And it'll set something in turn, right? So we will, inside of there, we'll create another variable called result. And that will be the value M, whatever that value is, times, say, 12 pixels. And then we will @return the result value. So when we call this function, right? What this is going to do is it's going to take whatever value we call it within the attribute here. It's going to multiply it by 12. And it's going to return that value here. And that's actually similar to the way that this column 6 works in SCSS or in Bootstrap, right? Is that I can set up columns this way, and I can basically say, oh, well, okay, I want to have, say, a value that is going to be, if I want 12 columns that go across, I can have values 1 through 12. And so if I have call 6, then I can call that with the column function of 6 in there, right? So it goes back and it takes 6 and it multiplies it by some sort of value, gives me 6 columns. Right? That's sort of the way that works, right? In this instance, we're using it to set the height of an object. So now I can just multiply some value by 12, which is sort of arbitrary, but it is fine enough for the example here. So if I wanted to take our header, and I wanted to make it a little bit taller, right? I can take that header, and I can make the height of it the result of our set height function, which is set height, H-E-I-G-H-T, with some value in the attribute here. So if I wanted it to be, say, 144 pixels tall, I would put 12 here because 12 times 12 is 144. And we see that done like that. Now, this is good for creating a system of proportions. Right? That's essentially what we're doing here is we have this function to where we're working in a system of proportionality. Right? Because I can use this set height function for anything, right? Like I could even use it for, say, if I wanted to add some margin on this H1. Right? This is an H1, right? Well, first of all, I don't have to specify that H1. Since that H1 is inside the header in SCSS, I can just put it inside of the header rule. So now I have a nested rule. And so now I know that if I want margin top set on the H1, I can run set height. 6 would be half the height. So we could see that in action if we do that. Now that is going out into this space. So we'll just set a little bit of, we'll set like 12 pixels of padding on that. Like so. And then we can change that margin top to be like 3. Right, move it around. And actually, I think I want to move this padding here. Is what I want to do. I want to move this padding and put it here. And just put some padding on the parent so it contains it. And so then we see something like that, right? Proportionality. So it takes and it pushes that H1 down and pushing it down 3 times 12 when the height is 12 times 12. I mean, we could even use that height to set sizes for things, right? Like we called it set height in this instance, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense here to use it just as a general size. But if I wanted to make my H1 bigger, I could do that as well, right? So font dash size, set height times 4. That'll make it 48 pixels. All right, and so then if we started doing math here, well, if the entire height is 12, right, proportions, if the entire height is 12, the set height is 4, that leaves me with 4. As the margin top. Now that's not exactly 100% the way that it works, but it gets us to an interesting sort of place, right? Like that is about where we would want that to be, right? Like if we highlight that, we see the entire 48 pixel height there. It goes above it, that extends above and below, so we might want to adjust some other things on it as well. But that's pretty cool, and we can just run a text align center on that H1 as well, just to center up that text. And it's just right there in the middle. Right, so we can use the proportions that we get from this function and just do some calculations, and then instead of trying to do quick math, we can just adjust numbers in small increments until we get what we really like. Right, which is pretty cool. So see, for the main here, I think we can just kind of treat the main regularly, right? So we can take our main section here, give it just a simple white background. We can give it, we can center it up with margin 0 auto. We can give it a padding of set height 1 if we want to, right? Because we took all the padding off. So we could add 12 pixels back in there by doing that. And we can also give it just like a min height value here of set height 32 if we wanted to do something like that. Right, so now we have something pretty neat there. We've got this span here in the footer that I might want to text align center, right, just to center that up. Maybe in that footer I want to add some padding, maybe set height to 24 pixels of padding. Right, just so we have that like that. Something else that we could do here, right, is we could adjust the link color. And so we could make another color for that. And one of the cool things that we can do with this is, well, we can use these other values. Right, so if I want a $ link color, well, I can darken my $ heading color. Say 50. And now I have a link color that I can use. Right? So if we look here in our main, we can nest a paragraph in there. We can nest anchor tag in there. And we could say color $ link color. And that'll take that link color and change it to the variation of the heading color. And it might be even a little too dark here. So let's lighten it up just a little bit by doing that. And that's pretty cool. Right, so now if we want this same website, but we want it to have different colors, we just have to change one value, which is that color variable value variable there. I could change it to something like 174. And it changes the entire look and feel of my website. Right, pretty simple site. But using the SCSS in this sort of way really gives us the ability to have some fun with it, and make something that is templatable, easy to use, and just kind of pretty, right? Like, that's nice. And so really with that, that's the extent of my demo. That's the extent of what I want to do today. All right, we're just trying to keep it a little simple here. All right, don't forget to check out the videos in the module so you can get another look at how some of these things work. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.